Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Aisha, your host. In our segment last week, we discussed a summary of Quranic verses that relate to just war theory. We'll wrap up our discussion on this topic today by reflecting on the series and exploring counter-arguments to just war theory. Join me now as we sit down with Dr. Shabir Ally. Welcome to the show, Dr. Shabir.
Pleasure to be on.
So we're on our last episode now of Just War Theory, and recently we covered, a summary of the Quranic verses. We went through, what's just going into a war, during the war, at the end of the war. Looking at the times we're living in now, do you think it needs to be more actively considered as a theory?
Yes, it is very important because often wars are waged around the world by modern interests who are not necessarily Muslims, and everyone says that our war is just, or we have just cause, and we must do this. But when wars are measured against the just war theory, we see often that they fall very much short. For example, the war on Iraq, what was called, and Canada thankfully did not join in that war. But when it is evaluated, it is found to fall short of the just war theory.
Well, and there's also the war going on right now in Syria as well. So
yes, on the other hand, we find that there are Muslims who say that they are fighting on behalf of Islam and Muslims. They are fighting in the name of God, but their fighting does not measure up to our understanding of just war theory from within the Muslim tradition. Their actions do not conform to the Quran or to the life example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Quite the contrary. They violate the Quran, they violate the principles left by our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and yet they say that they are fighting in the name of God and in the name of Islam. So they violate just war theory, both as formulated from within the Muslim tradition and outside of it.
Now, we know just war theory in our discussions, it's very much guided by the principles that are in alignment with the Quranic verses. But are there any objections to just war theory?
Yes, there are two principal objections. So one is from the side of realism. Some people say that it's too impractical to think about all of these stipulations. You must have all of these rules in place. For example, proportionality, you must have just cause and right intention. And they say that these are too many restrictions on the war. If you have reason to go to war, then you go to war, and you cannot have all of these ethical considerations. War by itself necessarily is messy, and hence they've coined the term all is fair in love and war. They think that if we're going to go to war, no holds barred. But this is an objection that, of course, we need to counter by re-emphasizing that even if you are going to go to war, then you have to go to war in a disciplined manner. There has to be the principle of non-combatant discrimination, non-combatant immunity, discriminating between combatants and non-combatants. There has to be the principle of proportionality. Imagine if we throw that out of the window. Nowadays, with the advanced nuclear weapons, we have the doomsday scenario that has now become real. If nations fire nuclear weapons against each other, then very easily large segments of the human population can be wiped out.
Well, then there's no value for human life in that sense.
And that would be totally unconscionable. So we need to re-emphasize the principles of just war.
When we're talking about pacifism, what about some verses from the Quran that help us counter this, people who say, well, this is the approach, therefore we should just scrap just war theory?
Yeah, well, realism is one objection. The other objection is pacifism. And from the pacifists will say, well, if to go to war in the first place is wrong, because war is messy. Here again, the idea of the war being messy, killing people, is accepted both by realists and pacifists. But realists say that because war is so messy, necessarily we can't worry about ethics, whereas the pacifist says that because wars are so messy, you should never enter into war in the first place. No matter what is happening, war is totally bad. But the answer to that from the Quranic perspective, and I think this is where your question is headed, is that both from the Quranic perspective and the biblical perspective, it is wrong to let evil flourish. And if, let's say, there is an oppressor who is killing people, there's a tyrant who is murdering and raping and pillaging and so on, then to leave that tyrant unchecked, that itself is bad. And the Christian principle of loving your neighbor requires also coming to the aid and protection of your neighbor. It is no virtue and it is not justice to just stand by and look at people suffering. You need to remove the cause of that suffering. And if there is a tyrant, there is an oppressor that needs to be removed by going to war against him, then that becomes necessary. And Professor Darrell Cole of Drew University, whose book I introduced earlier in the show, in the series, the book entitled When God Says War is Right, he argues the point from within the Christian tradition that in fact there is a very good precedent from within the Bible itself for coming to the defense of people who are being oppressed, and it would be very un-Christian, of course from his point of view, to leave people in that oppressed state and to leave oppressors in their place, oppressing people, while arguing for pacifism. On the contrary, he says that Augustine before him and other Christian thinkers have held that war is not to be conceived of as a lesser evil, so that we use this lesser evil in the face of a greater evil. No, he says that war itself is a good thing. The application of force is a good thing so long as it is applied properly with all of the principles that we have described under the Just War Theory.
So it's really interesting that it's not just the Quran, but the Bible and other religious scriptures, it seems, that take into account sort of a justice-based approach when it comes to looking at war.
Yes, and this is how I would understand the verse of the Quran, since you asked me about verse from the Quran, which says, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِتَالُ وَهُوَ كُرْهٌ لَكُمْ. War has become inevitable for you, even though it is something dislikable to you. فَعَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. Perhaps you hate a thing that is good for you. وَعَسَىٰ أَن تُحِبُّوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ شَرٌّ لَكُمْ. And perhaps you love a thing, but it is actually bad for you. So yes, war is disagreeable. It has many elements that make us all recoil in horror, but at the same time it becomes necessary, not as a necessary evil, but something that is one of the forces that God has left in our world to be applied if and when necessary, but in a disciplined and correct manner that takes care to not harm civilians, to use proportionality so that you do not go overboard. The Quranic principle about this is la ta'tadu, do not transgress limits.
And I know you mentioned one book already, and we've covered that in the earlier segments of the series. Are there any other books or resources you would direct people to if they want to learn more about Just War Theory?
Yes, there's an interesting book by Omid Safi entitled War, Peace and the Limits of War. And there is a book by John Kelsey entitled The Just War and Jihad.
Perfect. Thank you very much once again for an engaging discussion, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.